Welcome to season 2 of Brain Trash. This is the podcast where we take the DSM, we light it on fire, and we roast marshmallows over the ashes of all of the crusty ass white dudes who wrote that shit and fucked up some lives. So this season, we're actually going to be talking about a lot of interesting topics and starting off strong with talking about autism and sex. You're going to want to sit down and tune in. My name is Maria and
I'm Tabitha.
We are psychiatric nurse practitioners, and we are here to dig into all of the unfiltered and untalked about things that you want to know about. So let's talk about sex today. So today we want to start off strong and talk about something that a lot of people realize there are differences in and might have some misconceptions about: sex and autism. So I think a lot of people have misconceptions that autistic people are asexual, or maybe autistic people are too naive to have sex or don't have strong sexual relationships, right? There are just kind of a lot of misconceptions rolling around. And if you are autistic and listening, you're going to realize that like a lot of times we are infantilized. Is that the word? Infantilized? How do I say it?
I think it's infantilized.
Infantilized.
Are we putting the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable?
I don't. That word. It's my speech issue. Anyways, so much that like people don't assume that we have sex, so then they just don't talk about it, right? So there are just so many things that are just unspoken about. So yeah, we're going to start about talking about just kind of sexual experiences. We're going to go into like the sensory stuff, all of that. So as healthcare providers, we do talk to our patients, and sex life does come up because obviously it's a part of like medication side effects and just things people share, right? So what have you heard from some of your patients that have kind of like sparked the thought of doing this podcast episode?
Well, I think the original idea was kind of born out of this conversation I have with a lot of neurodivergent patients, which is like just that need to not be perceived by other people, right? And so that happens everywhere in our lives, not just with sex, but like when it's something like sex, when it's a topic that isn't talked about a lot, or that is very much like, I mean, the exposure that most people get to sex other than their own experiences is whatever happens in movies, right? Somebody pushes you against a wall and sticks it in and things are great and that's it, right? So there's like a very idolized, I guess, like way it's supposed to be. And so when you're being perceived in a vulnerable position, right, where maybe you don't feel comfortable, or things sensory wise are weird, or you're not having the experience that you see other people having in the media or whatever, it can be a really confusing experience. And so when people do bring up sex in appointments, or when I'm talking to colleagues or other professionals about it, this is something that I end up talking about with them a lot. And that idea of being perceived as a neurodivergent person, plus how much weirder that can get during sex.
Yeah, as far as being perceived, there is this concept in neurodivergence that a lot of people don't like, that people are looking at them and seeing them, watching them, and there can be a pressure to perform. So where we get our information sometimes for sex is like, how do we perform? What are we supposed to look like? What are we supposed to act like? How do we move, right? Especially like if you have dyspraxia and movements are kind of awkward or like not coordinated, which isn't sexy most of the time. So it can be kind of tricky when it comes to that. So being perceived is this concept where we are kind of like worried about people watching us and watching us perform. And that can be in social interactions in real life. Like people are watching us like do a new task, but sex is this weird intimate thing where like the pressure is directly on you, right? Like people are watching just you. Well, in most cases, there are other things going on in the room that people are paying attention to. And then you're expected to perform in this sort of way. And unless you're getting like your information from porn, scripting can get kind of weird. And like you might have planned out some things to say, but then like, is it awkward? Am I saying the right thing? Am I making the right faces? Am I making the right movements? Like if you have dyspraxia and you're not coordinated and like that's not sexy. Just so many components go into sex and like the movements and just all of the feelings, and that can be really stressful, right? Specifically for autistic people.
Well, yeah, and I think that concept of masking as well, like, I think that's something that, especially for people who are diagnosed in adulthood, don't realize is a thing until they realize it. And then they're like, holy shit, I'm doing this all day, every day, in every realm of my existence. Like, I am in a grocery store thinking that person down the aisle, how are they perceiving me? Do I look like a regular shopper with my shopping cart? Are my hands weird on this?
Do I have
Should
T-Rex
I
arms?
stand there? Do they wonder why I'm choosing this item on the aisle, right? Like, there's so much of that, like, coordination internally to be like, how do I appear regular?
Yeah, and I
For a lot of people, that it can be really severe in other areas of our lives that we don't even realize it until we realize it.
so like what does it look like to mastering sex, right? Like from when I think about it, it's pretty much like, okay, what face am I supposed to make? Like, what sound am I supposed to make? How does that sound? Is it being perceived weird? Okay, they just did X. What do I do in response to Y? Do you know what I mean? Like, anything else you can think of as far as like, what does that look like? Because people probably don't even realize that they're masking during sex. They're probably like, doesn't everyone do this?
Yeah. No, I think that that's really, when I have this conversation with people, that's really commonly where we get to is like, wait, isn't everybody doing that? I'm like, well, yes, I think there's to a certain extent, um, there is peace. It depends, I guess, on the culture too, and like what just societally, like how you were brought up, all those things, right? Some people may not feel the need to make their experience pornographic, right? Or like have the right noises or the right sounds based on, I guess, the area that you live in or whatever. But for the most part, everybody's got like some thoughts about that. But when it's something that's like the entire time, you're like, okay, I need to also experience pleasure while I'm doing this thing that is making sure that I'm not making a feral noise or that I'm not making a weird face or, like where am I supposed to put my limbs, right? Like there's so much that goes into it. So,
Yeah, and there have been a couple studies that have been done that we're going to kind of like review through this episode. There have been some qualitative studies that have looked at like autistic women and masking and like the experience. And there are women who like report that they feel they like appear to be like behaviorally interested in sex, but they're not actually enjoying it because like they feel like stressed out and they are masking throughout it and they just feel kind of disconnected from their bodies, one, and like two, from their partner. What we do know is that autistic men, experience their first sexual encounter later in life than autistic women. And autistic women are more likely to have more sexual encounters than autistic men. And I think like my guess would be, as an autistic woman, that like you want affection and you like think that like you should build a connection. And it seems like a very like surefire way to like, this is how I connect with people, right? Like this is special. This makes sense. Or like I'm supposed to fuck that guy in date 3, right? Well, I have date 4 coming up and like I haven't fucked him yet. Should I fuck him yet? You know?
there's like so much scripting that happens just based on those exposures that we get in the media, right? Or things we hear from our friends or whatever, right? And especially now that pretty much every kid has the entirety of the internet at their fingertips, right? Like from a very young age, I think we're being exposed to more and more things, which leads to these experiences where maybe, right, the masking is happening because it's this very scripted experience. Like, oh, if this happens to me, I'm supposed to look this way and do this thing. And if I say something mean or say no and try to set a boundary, like I will be perceived incorrectly, or I'm a bitch, or I'm a prude, or whatever, right? And then that leads to these experiences that don't necessarily feel like trauma or rape or things like that in the moment because they're following a script, right? But looking back on it, I think a lot of times when autistic women finally get into trauma therapy and start working on these things, they realize like, holy shit, I was like really susceptible to coercion. And like, I was
Yes.
just going along with these things because that's like, I think how it was supposed to go. But now that I'm hearing other people's experiences, I'm like, wait, that was actually really fucked up. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Like I think there's this kind of like perception of like what is rape, right? And like what is sexual assault. And like for autistic people, autistic women in general are more susceptible to being sexually abused, being raped, and to having unwanted and not pleasurable sexual experiences. Obviously, those are two separate things, but like specifically, almost 3 times more likely than neurotypical women to have unwanted sexual experiences. And I think a lot of that is like, I'm on a date with somebody and they're telling me I need to sleep with them now, or like they've paid for me. And like, that's what this means. Like, if you are socially naive enough and you haven't had the education on like consent and boundaries and all of that stuff, because like, your parents sheltered you, or like sex education just doesn't cover that, or your school just doesn't have sex education, or like you grew up like religious, right? Like, how are you supposed to navigate those situations otherwise? So it is like incredibly common. And as you said, like people become very compliant because they're like, well, I don't know what to do and I don't know how to say no. And like, if they push back when I say no, then what? Right?
Well, yeah, then there's confrontation, and that would be
Oh,
totally
like
fucking
competition's a
unacceptable.
no.
But
Yeah,
also,
no.
there's this social pressure that kind of also ropes back around into that thing you were talking about, like autistic men having later sexual experiences. Is like most of the research actually shows like solo exploration of sexual stuff, so masturbation or just like exploring bodies, all of that, the sensory aspect of it. Most people who are autistic are doing that by the age of 18. So it's not like, hey, everybody's waiting till they're
Right.
30 to have sex or to do anything with their body. It's more so that takes time to make the approach, all of that. Also, though, the social aspect of that, being a weird dude and a virgin is just like a thing, right? Like, you're just not in, like, it's just normal, right? Like, oh, he's just autistic. Being a weird girl is like, there's lots of like weird, nuanced, like fetish shit, right? Like, there's
Oh
lots
my
of
God, yeah.
stuff where that's really sexualized for women to be weird or to have strange outfits they wear or, special interests and all that shit. So, like, socially, that we also get sexualized at a much younger age.
Yeah, for sure. Dudes will fuck anything when it comes to that. But like even even if we're looking at like experiences of like LGBTQ people, right? Like there are people in that community who women still report having again like more unwanted sexual advances and like more unpleasurable sexual experiences overall, which I think kind of just comes back to like again like the social pressures and like kind of like going into these things of like, well, who am I supposed to be? And like, if I am like trying to like experiment with this partner, like do I have to do that? Like what does intimacy look like? Is there other ways to be intimate? I just think navigating that stuff as a human is so fucking hard. And then you add autism into it and kind of like all of the nuanced things that like nobody just explains to you in a literal way. It's just so much harder, dude.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, like the men thing too, like on that note, a lot of like autistic people do enter into like the sexual realms earlier on online platforms because that's a lot more accessible than like an IRL in real life platform. You know what I mean? So like it might be easier to navigate like I don't know sex through what kind of platforms people use for sex. I know that there's like different things that people have like cyber sex on.
I'm
I don't
like,
know
my
back in the
old
day,
ass, I'm like, I don't know,
AOL chats.
in chat rooms, like ASL.
ASL 10. Oh wow, I'm 55. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
God. It's
So,
ringing bells.
but I think now there's so much more ability to be anonymous on the internet. There's so many more communities to be a part of, right? So I don't even know that there is any one specific platform but more so in general that is way more available than it's ever been.
Yeah, and a lot less stressful of like people will accept you more because you're not showing your face. Um and there's so many like kink communities, which is actually kind of how this episode like came to be, is that we just had our company retreat and we went to Pride, and like we were walking around and like we were looking at like all of the kind of kink things that happen, like with the knowledge that autistic people are more common, right, and LGBTQ demographic in general. And then looking around, be like, there's a lot of like kink here too. There's a lot of furries, and like I just have my own feels about like people in costumes because I was traumatized by Big Bird as a child. So I was just very anxious, but like people are like happy and hugging and like, I'm gonna hide in a corner. It's fine. Like you do you. But it kind of just brought up those conversations for us to be like, what are the relationships of these things? And like, what are the things that people aren't talking about, right?
And what's the underlying reason for it? Because when it's like one kid in high school wearing a tail, everybody finds that really easy to as a bullying target, right? But when you've got an entire like miles and miles of a large city filled with people who are deeply immersed in this culture and doing this thing, is like there has to be underlying benefit or reasoning or something like that behind it that is causing this to be such a successful movement. And so really starting to dig into like what is it about that, and to me I think I always come back to that, like, I mean, how great is it to just like not feel perceived, and wearing a mask, it'll do that.
Yeah. So we have a whole episode coming up next week on kink and pups and all the little subculture things. So you guys will have to tune in for that. But just to kind of like, we discussed a lot of like the concerns that are present for autistic people around sex and why it's different. But like, what can people do? Like, how do we make things better for autistic people, right? Like, as medication providers, are there things we can do? As therapists, is there anything we can do? Like, what can we do?
Well, I think first and foremost, like encouraging people to understand themselves in a non-shameful way of like what sensory things they need, and whether that's in solo exploration or with a partner, right? Figuring out what is it that truly feels good and doesn't feel good, so that they have the language to create that. If it is with another human, they have the language to create that. I think from just like a mental health professional standpoint, whether that's therapy or med provider, like being as completely non-judgmental as possible, because I think there is so much like stigma and just stereotypes about stuff like this that it really matters to just like listen to somebody and hear what they're saying and validate the feelings that they're feeling, and also stay curious and help them understand like what is it about this that brings you the distress, and how can we make it not that way for you? How can we give you the tools and the language to feel better about it? And then like from a med standpoint, obviously meds can totally have side effects, right? So that can be increased libido, it can be decreased libido, it can be I mean, those are the main ones I would say. So,
Well, I mean, it could be delayed orgasm. It could be like not feeling anything. Like there are like so many variations of that, right?
Well,
like,
yeah, if I'm doing like an eval, I'm not asking somebody like, and when you're masturbating, do you like deep pressure or not, right? Like I'm not asking somebody that, but I am asking them about sensory things, right? If they describe having really terrible like interoception, or I can't feel light touch, or I hate light touch, or whatever, or if I can't feel a sensation fully, it makes me really pissed off, or whatever, then I know that person has that like hypo sensitive tactile stuff that might tell me that in a sexual sense they might experience the same thing. Doesn't mean that I'm going to outright ask them about it just to ask them, but if it comes up and we're talking about making sure that I am educating them about side effects of medications, so that they know, hey, this could make some of that sensory stuff worse.
So we actually have an episode coming up in about 2 weeks that's going to detail all of the stuff on like autism and sensory and hyposensitive and hypersensitive and sex. And there's a lot to unpack on that. So make sure you subscribe for that and watch out for that on YouTube and whatever your podcast platform is. But yeah, I'm really with you on like kind of like from the therapist perspective and the med provider perspective of like having those open conversations with people, and kind of like more so than even just like how are the side effects, but like offering education when it comes to these things. Or like if they're saying something like, there's something like, oh, I had sex with him because X, Y, and Z, or I feel like I'm very performative, like explore that, right? Because like a lot of that can be masking, and people aren't talking about that. And even if masking conversations are coming up and you know that somebody is sexually active, like that could be a topic to explore in therapy. Like, do you enjoy sex? Like, is this something that you hate doing, but you just put on an act for, but you feel like you wish you could enjoy, right? Like we have to remember that like it's awkward to talk about sometimes depending on how you are raised, but like this is a huge component of people's life, and we want to make sure like there's quality to that, right?
There's also like in that same realm, like if you have clients who are older dudes who are not reporting having any sexual activity or whatever, just assuming that person is not sexual is doing them a disservice, because this also leads to poor sex education, lower incidence of using condoms, right? Which can then lead to all these other outcomes that are not great. So not making assumptions about people's sex lives, sexualities, pleasure, all of that based on your own experiences, but making them based on a well-informed evidence-based opinion.
Or biases, right? Like as you mentioned, like sometimes people are just awkward, and we can't just assume like, oh, he's probably not sexually active, or she or they are not sexually active, right? Like we should still be asking in all of those situations. As med providers, it's like important for us obviously to like assess things like birth control and interactions, but also like we're still doing sexual health education and making sure that people are being safe, right? Like that's still part of our job. As a therapist, I'm not sure like the exact role on that, but I think like still like an exploratory stage for like if somebody is in a relationship or they're not, or they're like having lots of partners, or kind of where they are. I think if you are just a neurodivergent person and you're not a mental health professional and hearing this and you're like, yes to all of these things, these are like the points where you should be like talking to your partner and be like, hey, I would like to unmask during sex. Like, what could that look like for me? If you have a neurodivergent partner, this could be an experience that you guys could take together. If you have a neurotypical partner, that's a different game. That might be something that would deserve its whole own episode, and maybe some like guidance on like sex therapy with somebody who is like neurodivergent affirming, because I'm sure that's a little bit different.
Yeah, and listening to others in the neurodivergent community about what has and has not worked for them, right? Not everybody's going to be the same. Everyone's experiences are going to be very nuanced based on who you are as a person, sensory stuff, all of that. But at the same time, hearing other people's voices and knowing that like you are not the only one experiencing these types of barriers in a sexual sense is really important to destigmatize it, to take the shame out of it, right? To just like feel more human about the things that are going on for you. Because the only thing, again, that typically people are exposed to just in a general sense in the US is whatever the fuck we see in movies, which is not real.
Literally. And porn, right? Like if we're on the note of that, yeah, pretty much. And that's like the only exposure for a lot of people who just don't have the education, or like parents who are comfortable with talking to them or what have you. But, you know, I'll say now, like being a mom, like I don't even know what to say with my kid when she's like, you know, talking about genitals, and I was like, I'll be so comfortable, and I'm kind of like, man, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but that just kind of like opens the door of like, what's it gonna look like when we're hitting teenage years, and like I have to have these conversations. So
it's gonna get so much fucking weirder, I can promise. So
yeah, well, solidarity. Thanks for tuning in, guys, to another episode of Brain Trash and to our new season. We're really excited to explore the BDSM and kink communities on our next episode. So make sure you subscribe, hit like, leave us some questions. If you are interested in any sort of a topic, like we are more than happy to cover anything. So leave us a comment, send us a message, whatever your vibes are. Leave us a 5-star review. Also would be well appreciated. And yeah, dude, thanks for tuning in.